Welcome to Delivering Miracles, a podcast to teach women like you tips and strategies on how you can have a safer pregnancy so you can bring home a healthy baby. I'm your host and your high-risk pregnancy expert, Parijat Deshpande. I can't wait to chat with you. We have such a fascination with birth stories. I think it starts from generations and centuries ago when these stories were passed down from mother to daughter or mother-in-law to daughter-in-law. And even now, there's this sense of curiosity and of bonding almost to talk about the way that you transformed from who you were into being a mother of a brand new child. But there's something that is so personal about it. We try to connect and we try to bond. We try to find ourselves in other stories. We try to find a way to really deepen our connection with the women around us through these stories. And yet there's something so personal about it that no amount of detail can ever really truly make us feel like we've told our entire story. I feel like I've told my birth story a few times. I know I shared a little bit about it here on Delivering Miracles. I think episode 1 I shared a little bit, and another recent podcast on the other side of the birth when I met my son in the NICU for the first time. But it wasn't always the case that I could share that story. In fact, it took me a really long time to share that story because reliving it was very traumatic for me. I actually was pregnant at the same time as a bunch of my friends were pregnant. Not a lot of us had had babies before. I think there was only 1 or 2 friends that had had babies before us. And then all of us, so many of us were pregnant at the same time. And my son was due towards the end of that lineup, but because he came so early, he ended up being born almost at the very beginning of that lineup. And then after he was born, all of my friends started having their babies on time. And at first, I couldn't talk about what happened to me and I couldn't hear their stories. It would bring up so much anxiety and so many memories of things that I had just been through with my son that I didn't want to feel. I didn't want to hear. I remember at one point, I think he was still in the NICU, so he was probably about 2.5 months old. And a friend of mine who had delivered just a few days after he was born, but to a full-term baby, asked me, "Hey, someday I'd love to hear your birth story." And at the time, I thought, "You're crazy. Why would you want to hear my birth story?" Because my birth story has nothing magical or wonderful or transformative about it. It was awful, and it was the worst day of my life to give birth to my son at 24 weeks and 5 days. But 4 years out now, and I see what she meant. Because these birth stories are really meant to help us shape our identity as to who we are as people, as women, as mothers to this baby that we delivered. And it's a way to honor this incredibly momentous day, whether it had positive memories or negative memories or a mix of both. But it's really meant to help us integrate that into who we are and to share that with the world, with the people that are closest to us, about who we are now because of what we just went through. So today I thought it would be really fun to share some birth stories with you. And I've invited 2 people who are very dear to me, who have been an incredible support and an inspiration to me. The first is a friend of mine who delivered prematurely also. She delivered at 28 weeks, and you'll hear her story of what that experience was like, going from a super simple pregnancy that had nothing going on to make her think twice, to having her daughter be born at the very beginning of the 3rd trimester. And then another friend of mine who's very dear to me, who had a completely opposite experience with her birth and her delivery. And I can't wait to share those with you. So I'm going to invite them in now, and I hope that you find yourself and a piece of you and some hope and inspiration and some connection to these wonderful women who have birthed some incredible little babies. So I'm super excited to introduce you to my friend and also a preemie mom, Haley Gray. Haley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Parijat. I'm so happy to be here.
I have been so inspired by you and your story, and I just feel like for so many reasons the universe brought us together so that we know each other, and I would love for you to share your story of your high-risk pregnancy and the birth of your daughter, Laura.
Yeah, it was really funny. I was 25, and it seems like, in some ways it was yesterday, although it's been forever because she's 18 now. And I had a very typical pregnancy up until I didn't. And I suddenly, at 28 weeks, I went in for my 28-week checkup. Everything was beautiful. And I woke up one morning and I was having contractions. And I was showing signs of being in labor. I had, pretty much all of the classic symptoms from, the irritable stomach to, just contractions, and everything just kind of hit like boom out of nowhere. And they put me... And
that's as like a first-time mom, first-time pregnancy, mom. And 28 weeks is not that far along at all. That must have been terrifying.
It was absolutely probably one of the scariest things I think has ever happened to me. So they put me on bed rest because I was having a few contractions, but they weren't really convinced that I was in labor, and they gave me terbutaline. And less than 24 hours later, I was having a lot more contractions. So I went from, okay, I'm having the occasional odd, really kind of light contraction to, okay, I'm like actively in labor. And that was the point at which they were like, okay, betamethasone. They had me in the doctor's office for several hours, getting monitored, et cetera, et cetera. They're like, okay, well, terbutaline works. So they sent me home, and they were getting me all hooked up with a home pump and everything, and everything started really happening kind of fast at that point. And they're like, okay, you're going to be on bed rest for the next, 3 months. And I'm like, oh crap, because I'm going to miss my brother's wedding. And, everything. And then all of a sudden I woke up and I'm in labor. And so back to the hospital. What did that
feel like? How did you know that you were in labor?
I was having contractions every 4 minutes, and that all of the symptoms that they tell you to watch out for labor. So, your stomach gets upset, you get nauseous, you start to have some diarrhea, you've got contractions, and they're so many minutes apart. And I was like, there was no doubt in my mind that my body was in active labor at that point.
You just knew.
I just was dead certain. There was no question.
Yeah. So you'd tried the tocolytics, terbutaline. So that, for those of you that are listening, that aren't familiar, tocolytics are any kind of medication that helps stop preterm contractions. Terbutaline is one of them. Magnesium's another one. Nifedipine's another one. Depending on where you are in the world, they'll be called different things. So you had that. You got the betamethasone shot, which is the steroid shot to help Laura develop her lungs, because 28 weeks is really early for a delivery. But despite all that, you were on bed rest. You weren't moving, and still your body said, okay, no, it's time.
Yep. And that was the point at which I was hospitalized, and they actually put me in the hospital in Trendelenburg position. So my head was down lower than my feet.
Oh my God, Trendelenburg. I have such a love-hate relationship with Trendelenburg.
Yeah, me too. And oh my gosh. And then they put me on mag sulfate.
Which is magnesium sulfate. For those of you guys listening who aren't familiar, it's like the heavy hitter, hardcore, like this is all we've got left to help you stay pregnant. It is
ugly,
awful. What was it like for you when you were on it? What symptoms did you have?
I was hot. I was cold. I was throwing up. It was awful. And there was a girl that was a teenager who was down the hall from me who was giving birth and screaming the whole time. So I'm there in my in my hospital room, you know, upside down, miserable, you know, monitors attached to everything.
Right.
I don't think I've ever had so many wires attached to my body in my life.
Isn't it amazing? Like every possible place they could find, there's something to monitor something of yours, right?
Something. And the thing with the magnesium sulfate is that because it is helping slow down the contractions, well, it can also affect your heart. Right. And your breathing and everything else. So they have you on constant monitoring and the baby on constant monitoring to make sure, you know, because this is one of those drugs that, you know, in the right amounts is good for you, and in too much is, it can kill you. So it can be really, really scary. And
they don't use it unless they really, really need it. I mean, this is like, I remember when I was put on magnesium, they explained it like, this is the last thing that we've got. If you're on it, this is it. And so they really try to push that out as much as possible unless you really, really need it.
Right. And that really wasn't working that well. So they actually started alternating the terbutaline with the mag sulfate for me. To try to keep me pregnant just a few more hours. Because at 28 weeks, the longer that you stay pregnant is, you know, the longer the baby is not in the hospital.
Right. And that's what I love. I'm so glad that you said that, Haley. And that's what I love about working with the clients that I work with and really just doing this podcast and sharing this with women is that at 28 weeks, when you're in active labor on magnesium, really making it to 40 weeks isn't possible. I mean, maybe miracles happen all the time, but we're not looking at making it to term. We're looking at how many more hours can we get with you? How many more, even if it's a day, if it's a week. I mean, holy cow. Like it makes such a difference for the baby.
And can we give the, you know, the betamethasone, the steroids for the lungs, a chance to actually work?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We're just stacking the deck in your favor as much as we can to help you and your baby.
Right. And unfortunately, she decided she was not going to stay put. 24 hours later, my water finally broke. And there was meconium in the water. So that was very stressful. And they decided at that point that she was coming, that there really wasn't anything else they could throw at it to stop my labor. And it was that point that they flipped from the mag sulfate and the terbutaline to putting me on Pitocin. Because if they've decided at that point that they're going to have her come out, they're going to have her come out as quickly as possible. And they actually wheeled me to an operating room, and there were a bunch of medical students around, like ready to grab her. And this all passed in the space of about like an hour and a half from my water breaking to like me like delivering.
Yeah, that's very true. And something else I want our listeners to really understand is that the earlier you deliver, the faster it goes. And I remember my doctor saying that too, that when it happens, it's going to be quick. And in my mind, I thought, oh, okay, sure, it'll be like 3-4 hours. I hear it goes on for 24, 48 hours. I don't know. Maybe it's a few hours. It can be really a matter of minutes.
I didn't even push.
Right, exactly. You don't need to this early.
No, I mean, they refer to babies that are that early as cannonballs for a reason, because they come out shooting out like a cannonball. They're so fast to be born, and because they're so focused on baby being born, I was actually very, very lucky because I had a vaginal birth, and she was having some heart decelerations in there, but it apparently, because she came so fast, it avoided just barely in the nick of time the C-section that was about to happen. Okay. So, yeah, but she came out, she was screaming, she had APGARs of 8 and 9, but because she was so premature, yeah, it was amazing, right? We didn't actually know whether we had a boy or a girl, we just heard the screaming as they caught her in this fleece blanket and go whisking her out of the room to intubate her as quickly as possible. Because they knew with, a preemie that early that the first thing they have to do is intubate, which is putting them on a ventilator as quickly as possible.
Right, because the lungs aren't ready to breathe yet. You want to give them all the chance in the world to just be and to stay alive and not focus on trying to breathe, which takes a lot of toll on such a tiny little body.
Right, and then they start pumping in surfactant, which is a chemical that our lungs produce to make them more soft and function better. And I don't know how else to describe it. It's kind of the oil that runs our lungs,
So what was this like for you? I can imagine, because I went through my own experience kind of like this, of a very early birth, but being wheeled into the OR and not being able to see your baby right away, and this being your first child that you were pregnant with, what was that like?
It was absolutely terrifying. I mean, to say anything else, it was completely terrifying. And utterly heartbreaking, because I couldn't even hold her until she was a week old. She was over a week old by the first time I held her, and I still couldn't hold her by herself. It was still holding her in a pile of blankets, because she still had in a central line, which is a line that went in through her umbilical cord, that they were using for an IV line. So that was really, this thing that they had attached to her, and that it's only held in with one stitch. So if that
you have to be very
comes
careful.
loose, then you're at risk of killing your child. So you have to be so careful. So, and you can't touch them because you overstimulate their nervous system. So you're sitting there going, okay, I really want to hold my baby, but I can't even touch them.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking is totally the word for it.
Mm-hmm.
And how long was Laura in the NICU before you got to bring her home?
She was in the NICU for 53 days.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
For a 28-weeker, that is amazing.
Right. Yeah. We went through all the typical stuff, your apnea, your bradycardias. She had anemia. She had multiple blood transfusions. She had a pneumothorax. So she actually blew a hole in her lungs that took us almost a week to get resolved. So she went through so many things, physically, but she she grew so quickly, and she did very, very, very well. And she has continued to do really well.
That's incredible. And I've gotten a chance to talk with her a couple of times, and I can't even tell you, for those of you that are listening and are pregnant right now and are at risk of delivering early, I want to tell you that now you've got two stories of hope, mine as well as Haley's, that these kiddos, they are born with this willpower, and it's just a matter of us being able to support them to help them survive and thrive. And it's scary, and it's terrifying, and it's heartbreaking, and it lasts with you a lifetime, as Haley said, right? She's 18 years old now, but sometimes it still feels like yesterday.
It does, yeah.
But there is hope.
Mm-hmm.
Haley, what message of hope do you have for our listeners who are currently on bed rest or in preterm labor and are terrified, like you were 18 years ago, that they might deliver their baby too soon?
Well, I think that it's important to remember that, this too does pass, even if it seems like it is taking forever. I actually spent 6 months on bed rest with my second pregnancy to try to prevent another preterm delivery. And she was delivered at full term, but it seemed like it took forever and about 20 years. I swear I was pregnant with her for about 20 years. And it is so stressful. Every single thing that your body does seems stressful at the time. And there's just almost like if you have an upset stomach, oh my gosh, am I going into preterm labor? Oh my gosh, was that the baby kicking, or was that a contraction? Oh my gosh, is my blood pressure going up? My feet are puffy. Oh, are my hands puffier or not puffier than they were yesterday? Oh, is this going on? Is that going on? And so you kind of tend to go into this overanalyze every single thing that your body is doing. Oh no, did my eyelash curl wrong today? That might be a symptom. And it can be just so terrifying. And learning to kind of draw on your inner strength and your meditation and use your support network around you. And I mean, there's some amazing people out there like you, Parijat, who do support women who are pregnant, which I wish I had totally had you around when I was pregnant. Oh my gosh, that would have made such a difference to my anxiety levels. But, you know, just having that support and just really focusing on one day at a time, and know that this too shall pass, and that the outcomes frequently are amazing. And you can't even visualize when you're holding a 2-pound baby in your hands that, you know, they're going to grow up and they're going to be an 18-year-old teenager who's 5'10", looks down at you and refers to you as fun size.
I love that. I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your story and for providing our listeners so much hope that things can be okay.
Thank you.
That was such an incredible story. And I know that there is so much behind that story that we just didn't get time to get into. But I really wanted to hit home for you how important it is to realize that things can happen anytime, in any way, whether you deliver preterm or at term. But Haley's story really shows us that there's hope, and that maintaining that hope is so important when you're going through, especially a really scary time like delivering prematurely. You know, Laura is incredible, and like I said, I've had an opportunity to talk with her a couple times, and she's so amazing and such an inspiration, as is Haley. And stories like this, especially if you're at risk for delivering early, are wonderful stories to keep in your back pocket to remind yourself that no matter what statistics your doctor's throwing at you, what numbers you hear, what type of expectation they have for your baby, each and every baby is completely different. And just because the statistics point one way doesn't mean that's how it's going to go. So definitely refer back to Haley's story on those days that you're feeling really worried about what happens if your baby is born too soon. So now I want to introduce you to a good friend of mine who is so amazing and has been such an amazing support to me, who has a really wonderful birth story that's completely different than the one that you just heard. So I'd love to introduce you to Sundae. Hi, Sundae. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to share my story with you guys today.
Yeah, thank you. I've heard a little bit of it and I was so inspired by it, and I know that our listeners are going to be too. So I'd love to know a little bit about your birth story and your experience with delivering your son.
Okay. Well, I have 2 children who are now 4 and 8, and my story begins in Bern, Switzerland. I'm originally from the U.S. and moved to Switzerland to be with my husband, who's from Bern. So my birth story begins with having a pregnancy in a foreign language and learning vocabulary. I don't even know if I knew in English, in German, and dealing with the uncertainty of being, in German, they call it a werdende Mutter, which means a becoming mother, that process of being pregnant, becoming a mother. Yeah, I really think that's beautiful. So going through that whole process of vulnerability that you go through no matter where you are, but in another cultural context. So my story begins there. And I feel really, really, really grateful for being in Switzerland at the time of the birth, because while the pregnancy was really, really quite uneventful, we had a little bit of a surprise at the end, because it had taken, I don't know if it was 30 or 32 hours trying to have a natural birth, and ended up in an urgent cesarean. However, I felt the whole time that I was well attended to. I had excellent care by my midwife. And for those of your listeners who are aware, there's a really great practice in many places in Europe where you're taken care of by midwives during a pregnancy, during the birth, and also well taken care of afterwards. So I knew I was in good hands no matter what was going to happen.
That's fantastic. And I love the fact that you had that trust, because I think that's so important during this whole process, especially if it's your first pregnancy, but even if it's your 3rd, 4th, 5th, it doesn't matter. Every pregnancy is so different, and having that trust that, hey, I'm being taken care of, I've got eyes on me, and I know that I will get the support that I need whenever I need it is so, so important.
Yeah, at least I had that. And I mean, you do feel vulnerable though, even if things are going well.
Of course, absolutely. I mean, it's not just your body anymore. You are solely responsible for this brand new life.
Yeah.
And it's scary. Even if everything is going beautifully well, it's still scary.
Yeah.
So talk to us then about the day, or I guess spanned maybe a couple days of when you knew your body was ready to welcome this little boy into the world.
Okay, well, my due date was August 7th, and this was in 2008. And on the day of my due date, my husband actually hurt his foot in soccer. So we had to go to the emergency room to check him out. But we were going to have an ultrasound anyway on my due date. And everything was fine and normal. And so what I did is we brought my hopping husband home on crutches, and I went around in my neighborhood on foot, wobbling left and right in August in the summer heat. And I got M&Ms, and I got mango, and I got fun things for us to snack on because I thought we'd stay home, keep him with his foot up, and we would probably watch movies because I thought even though it's a due date, everything's fine. I have plenty of time until the birth actually happens. And what turned out was my husband, had a rough day from hurting himself, and he was getting tired. And around 8 o'clock at night when we were finishing up, or I think we were making dinner, I started to feel some cramping in my back. And I was like, is this a contraction? And I'd never been, never had a baby before. I'd never been pregnant before. So I didn't know if this was it. And I could feel the contractions getting stronger. And I had back labor the whole time. So these are the very specific contractions that you get. And I thought, okay, here we go. It's going to start. So 8 o'clock at night, of course, not, after well rested in the morning, 8 o'clock at night. And I started to just sort of, well, here's what I did in hindsight, what I think I did kind of wrong. I think I had this idea that I could control the contractions. Like if I rested or if I walked, I would either slow down or speed up the contractions. Because what happened was my husband went to sleep and I stayed up and I, breathed through some of the contractions and I timed them and checked out how frequent they were. And they weren't ever so frequent that I thought, oh, here we go, for real. And I remember being very tired and calling my that's in German, my midwife in the morning, around 5 a.m. And I said, listen, I don't know, should I rest now or should I walk? Because I'm afraid if I rest, I'm going to slow down the contractions. But if I walk, I might be too tired for birth. And there was just a silence on the end of the phone. And she said, Frau Schneider, like Ms. Schneider, you can't really control your contractions. And I think I had this idea that I could control them, but really they happen to you. And I realized that later because the contraction started progressing until it caught the attention of my midwife, who came from outside of the city to be with me. And then things got real. Then we went into the bath. Like I wanted to have as natural of a birth as possible. And she gave me that space, even though it was hard, even though I was going through back labor, she really allowed me that space. So I hopped in the bath and I tried to see if that helped. I put my head against the wall and pushed really hard. I bossed my husband around and told him to, push here, do that now. And he was totally open. And I just really, tried to take the guidance from my midwife and my body until
absolutely,
until she said, okay, it's time to go to the hospital, because I didn't want to have a home birth. I wanted to have a natural birth, but in a hospital. That was what my husband and I decided we were most comfortable with. So we jumped into her Range Rover or whatever it was, and it was broad daylight now at this point, and this was really awkward because I lived in the city center of Bern, Switzerland, and I'm on all fours in the back of her car in broad daylight at a stoplight, and I'm as you know, as they teach you breathing through the contractions, but it's actually just moaning, in pain.
Yeah.
And, I felt kind of embarrassed, but I thought, I'm in labor. Like, what more can I do? And then we got to the hospital, and we were in this amazing birthing room. There's a bed with art. There's a birthing bath. There's a medical bed with all the machinery. There's a rope that you could hang from if you needed. There's balls and stools. It's like a playground for giving birth, right? You can try out whatever you need based on what feels right for you. And I don't know if they have those do they have those in California?
They have different facilities have different options. A lot of the hospitals are still very traditional with just the bed.
Okay.
But there are some that are bringing in bathtubs into a hospital, which I think is phenomenal. Otherwise, we have separate birthing centers for women who are low risk and are able to go and deliver there.
Okay, because they have that all in a hospital, and
That's
so
amazing.
I
I wish we
so
had that more here.
it's so phenomenal. And so what she did, and interrupt me anytime if I'm going on too long. I'm just sharing what's coming back to me now.
Yeah, of course.
We tried the birthing bath, and that felt like, because of the back labor, that felt like the thing that relieved the pain the most. But after, like I said, 28, 29, 30 hours, there was some point where I was only 5 centimeters dilated, which is only halfway there. And I looked at her, I think it had been 24 hours, and I looked at her and I said, I don't think I can, if I'm only halfway there, if I can do this for another 24 hours and then push. And she then decided to give me some homeopathic support. So they did acupuncture, they did this homeopathic stuff. And that's when it got kind of crazy, because I went through this, it brought on more contractions. So I went through a phase of almost like uninterrupted contractions where I would.
Wow, you must have been exhausted.
It was crazy. And you do the breathing, you're like, and you do the whole like breathing, they call it tonen in German, where you push into the contraction with your voice. And I would just get through that, and then another wave would come. And I really, I went into this like Charlie Brown sort of scene where I saw my husband talk to the midwife, and it was like, wah, 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 wah. And it was all kind of foggy and wavy. And I knew they were talking about something, but I wasn't really present. And then they did say, well, do you want to try an epidural? Because they thought maybe that would help shift the energy and help me progress more. And I also said at that point, like, I am not in my right mind. Like, can I give this to you and have you make a good decision? Because she knew what I wanted. She knew, we had trust, and she knew what I wanted. And so I basically said, I'm not in my right mind. So please support me based on what you know. And she said that she thinks an epidural could help shift the situation. And so we did. And that was so incredible, because all of a sudden I was like smiling, and we could have ordered a pizza. And I was like, great.
The world was shining again.
It was a completely different experience. It was like black and white. And I'm really happy. I'm really happy I did what I did for the 30 hours before, because I knew why I was doing it. I knew my reasons and what I wanted, right? So then it felt like the next right step to progress things that way. And unfortunately, fortunately, whatever you want to look at it, a bit into the process, we had to wait 2 hours for the anesthesiologist to come, which is really, it's kind of like when
long.
You know how if you were to be invited into a restaurant, and they say it's going to take an hour till you get to your table, but you can have a seat at the bar, you'd be like, okay, no problem. And you go to the bar and you have a drink. It was like going to a restaurant, being seated, and them saying your food is on the way, and then you wait for an hour. You know what I mean? Just like psychologically, it really was hard. Like, now that I've said I'm going to have anesthesia, and I still
had it right then and there.
Like 2 hours of going through this even further. And I don't want to scare anybody who's listening to this about birth stories, but my back labor was pretty intense. So finally, and I got in trouble. I got in trouble from one of the nurses because right when she wanted to put in the epidural into my spine, I think I had a contraction. I almost jumped off the bed, and she said something like, Frau Schneider, nicht Gumpala, or something like, don't jump around, Ms. Schneider, because that's dangerous, right? But it wasn't planned. It was subconscious, right? So anyway, they did that. Everything calmed down. And then all of a sudden, my midwife and the top doctor said, let's go talk. And then they left. And I knew something was going on because they weren't talking in front of me until now. They had talked only in front of me. And they came back and they said, listen, the heart rate is going up and down. And I could see that. You don't have to be a medical doctor to see it's going way high or way low for my son. And they said, this is not an emergency cesarean, but we do think this is an urgent cesarean. And they have to ask for your permission to do a cesarean. And I was like, there's no question. So they gave us the stats. We went in, they were basically like giving me something to drink, shaving my legs, putting on these, they call them strumpfos, and these tights for surgery, and rolling me in all at one time while my husband's signing forms. It was really fast, but it was still an element of no panic. It was intense. They did a great job with the urgency, but not panic, right? And and so they did the surgery. I think I almost vomited because of the whatever they give you. It was really, I thought, this is not the kind of moment I want to welcome my son into the world with my vomiting into a bowl. But I got through the nausea, and he was born, and we heard the cry that every parent waits for in the best possible way. And they brought him over, and I just thought, this is the absolute most gorgeous thing on the planet I've ever seen.
Oh my God, it's so heart-melting to hear that. Did you get to hold him right away, or at least get close to him?
Absolutely. My midwife brought him. She knew I was interested in breastfeeding. She put him right on. He latched on right away. It was the most magical experience. One that I didn't even have expectations about, but it just hit you. And it was wonderful. And I'm so grateful to be able to have, even though it wasn't, sort of the picture, what's picture perfect, like those women who have these births where they basically just pop them out and everything's done. Wasn't that? It was our journey, the whole, our new family together. And I felt so supported by my husband. He was a rock star before, during, and after, cheering me on. My midwife was there. I had an excellent medical team. So even in, what is not an easy situation, it's not a risky situation, it was still, an intense situation. I felt really supported, and I'm very grateful for that.
That is something that really stands out about your story to me, is just how important it is to be supported and to be at a place of peace and calm and be surrounded by people who you completely trust. Because whether you're low risk or you're high risk, that's something that's extremely important, because when you're in that moment, whether you are like Haley and delivering way too early, or you're like Sundae and you're delivering on time, but things are kind of going on, or you're in pain and you can't really think straight, you need to be surrounded by the right people who can take the load off of you so you can focus on the only thing that's important at that moment, which is safely bringing your baby into the world. One thing I'd love to mention that, Sundae, you said earlier, which is that the contractions happened to you and you thought you could control them. And I think that's such an interesting point, a really great point I want to hit home, which is that when you're in active labor, then the contractions will happen as they happen. And sometimes we've got medications and interventions to help you progress through labor. But that's different from preterm labor, which are contractions that you can control. And you can do that through medication and through lifestyle changes, through breathing techniques, and a bunch of different things that you can try that I often teach my clients. And so I want to differentiate the two, that if you're in preterm labor or you're having preterm contractions, there are things you can do. That doesn't mean that you're going to deliver your child imminently necessarily. But it's a great point to have, because this whole experience is all about control. And sometimes we think we have control and we don't, and we think we don't have control and we do. Mm-hmm. And knowing that difference is so, so important. So Sundae, as just kind of final thoughts, when you're thinking about your journey and reflecting back on it, what message of hope can you provide our listeners who are listening in today?
I think the message of hope is that when you realize you are pregnant, to start, as you summarized so well in the beginning, surrounding yourself with people that make you feel safe and supported, and take every single day forward with that mantra. Because, you find out you're 6 weeks pregnant, you're 6 months pregnant, you're in your 6th hour of labor. If you are able to focus on putting yourself at the center, which I think is hard because a lot of women put their baby at the center, right? Which is normal and natural and healthy, but really also put yourself at the center, because when you do that, when you say, I need to feel supported and safe, that actually protects your baby. And I'm not an expert like you are, Parijat, but that's my instincts through my own pregnancy journey, that if you're able to accommodate what your needs are and get those needs met and feel safe and supported, no matter where you are in your journey, then you've done what you can to support the process, no matter what the outcome is.
I love that. Oh, I love that so much. Thank you so much, Sundae, for sharing a bit about your journey and for providing such an inspirational story of hope for our listeners.
Thank you, Parijat. It is such a pleasure. Keep doing the amazing work that you're doing that is affecting so many people's lives.
Thanks so much. Oh my gosh, that was so much fun. I hope you enjoyed today's episode too. I feel like we could have had these women on the entire episode, gone on for hours talking about birth. As you can see, and I'm sure you already know, there are so many different kinds of birth stories, so many different ways of delivering a child, of becoming that mother, of going through that transformation from conception to pregnancy to delivery. And when you have a high-risk pregnancy, so much of it becomes medicalized that I think it's easy to forget the magic that happens when your baby is born. And especially when it's in a circumstance that is scary, like my story or Haley's story, there's magic. That your body made a human being. And whether we forget about what happens after that or not, and we just sit there for that moment and really embrace the fact that you made a little human. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. And so today, as you're going through your high-risk pregnancy and getting through all the anxiety, I want you to stop and just think about that for a second. There's magic happening right now. And I know we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know what's going to happen when you deliver the baby and what's going to happen to the baby. There's so much uncertainty. But right now, just feel that magic. It's amazing. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you want to know more about how you can cope with a high-risk pregnancy, manage your worries, and help yourself have a safer pregnancy, head over to my website at parijatdeshpande.com and schedule a consultation. I would love to chat with you. And I would love to stay in touch. So follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Both of my handles there are Parijat Desh. That's PARIJATDESH. Your pregnancy is your own, and your birth story is your own. And they really are very personal, and they shape your story and your journey. And I know when you have a high-risk pregnancy or you deliver too soon, it's not the story that you want. But over time, you will heal, and it will become yours, and it'll become a story that you're very proud of. Take it one day, one step at a time. You can do it.